In this video, I'm going to show you how I make a simple, everyday use cutting board. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So I have never done a video on cutting boards. Over here, I've got a couple of the first cutting boards I've ever made years ago. And I don't know if it's just me or if it's a lot of other woodworkers, but when they first jump into cutting boards, they think they got to have this thick monstrosity of a cutting board. This one I made is huge. And there are applications for this, I get it. You got your Thanksgiving turkeys, you got your Christmas prime ribs. This is when you're gonna wanna break these out. But for everyday use, to cut up a carrot or one pork tenderloin, you are not gonna wanna mess around with this. For the example of this video, just getting this out of the cupboard inside was a pain. Getting this into a sink to wash is a pain. It's okay to do it a couple times a year on the holidays. Those should be dedicated for those. Today, in this video, I wanna just show simple, everyday use. No crazy lines. At most, I used 2 different wood species in one. But for the most part, I like solid ones. Pretty boring, plain cutting board that you have no problem whipping out of the cupboard, cutting up what you need, putting it in the sink and washing it. So that is what we're doing today. I've got 7 of them here, but I'm gonna show you how I built one. Let's jump into it. Alrighty guys, so down here at my completely mess of a wood pile, I've had this piece of locust sitting around for quite some time. I forget why I even bought it. Maybe it was cheap at the time, but it was in between 1.5 inches and 2 inches thick, and it was completely surfaced. So locust being extremely hard, I decided with how much I had, it would be good for a cutting board. It's got a really nice grain to it, and I only had 1 knot to work around in this whole piece. The first thing I do when making a cutting board is cut it down to a length that's going to be near the finished length of my cutting board. So for me, for an everyday use cutting board, I like around 15-16 inches long. And I knew I was going to be able to get multiple cutting boards out of this piece of wood. And being that it was about 60 inches long, I cut 3 lengths out of it at about 18 to 20 inches. This was going to leave it a little wild, which is good to do because you may have to trim off snipe, you may have to trim off other things. So you always got to account for that kind of waste. And I just trimmed these lengths down on my crosscut sled. Now, I said this was completely surfaced, this piece of lumber is, but I have had this sitting around for about 3 years now. And I've moved it probably 100 times, so it had a bunch of dings in it and all that. So I did take the pieces over to my planer and cleaned up each of the faces. Now, a planer is extremely helpful when making cutting boards, but it is not completely necessary. You will have to start off with surfaced lumber, and you will spend a lot more time with the sander without a planer, but not completely necessary. And then after the 2 faces were cleaned up, I took it over to my jointer and just cleaned up 1 edge on that. At this point, we got 3 different options of cutting boards to make. We got our pieces cut down to rough length. It's a little longer than what our finished product's gonna be. And before we go any further, we gotta decide what kind of cutting board we're gonna make. We've got face grain, we've got edge grain, and we've got end grain cutting boards. So we'll start with the easiest, and that is the face grain. Now the face grain is gonna have a good look to it because that's got the most decorative grain, and it's also gonna be your easiest. You can basically go anywhere and pick up a finished 1x12, cut it to length, and you got yourself a cutting board. Throw some mineral oil on it, and it's basically a cutting board. The cons to that is face grain will tend to warp. So as it's getting washed and dried countless times, that will cause it to warp. Now you can get around that by slicing this down and orienting the grain in either direction, and that will minimize some warping, but that takes extra work. And then at that point, you may as well make an edge grain, which is what we're gonna be making today. Basically, we're gonna cut this in a bunch of different strips this way, and when we go to cut it this way, each strip is gonna be the thickness of our cutting board. We're gonna make it a little long because we're gonna plane it, but an edge grain, when it's glued up, will tend to be a lot more stable. And they're still relatively easy to make. It's just not as simple as going to buy a piece of wood and calling it a cutting board. The final option is an end grain cutting board. Now, I've personally never made an end grain cutting board. I probably will eventually, but honestly, they're just a lot of work for a cutting board with multiple different steps that will take multiple days to accomplish. For my money, I'm going with an edge grain. That's what we're doing today. So before we cut our strips on the table saw, what I like to do when the piece of wood is one piece is just take a pencil and reference it. So mark the whole piece of wood, and I'll show you why in a minute. Then we're going to make our way back over to the table saw, and as I said, the width of these strips that you're going to cut right now is going to be the thickness of your cutting board before planing, before sanding. Now, for an everyday use cutting board, I like a thin cutting board. And since we are going to be doing an edge grain, that is going to allow us to go a little thinner than a face grain or an end grain. So I wanted my finished cutting board to be between a 1/2 inch and 3/4. A 1/2 inch is getting pretty thin, but I definitely didn't really want to be much over 3/4. So I set my fence to 3/4 of an inch, maybe a hair over, and ripped down all the strips, just as many as I could out of that whole piece. And if you missed last week's video, yes, you may notice I got a new table saw. Not brand new, but new to me. So if you missed that, be sure to check it out. This thing had not been touched in 25 years, and I had to go through and get it working again, and I am sure glad I did. Next step, you're going to take your pieces and you're going to orient the way the boards are going to go for glue up. So this is where our pencil marks are going to come in that we did before we ripped it down. So when you're laying this out, how you're going to want to glue it up, you want to orient the pencil marks. So you'll put one piece against the clamps and have the pencil marks facing you. And then the next piece, you're going to have the pencil marks facing away from you. Next piece, facing you. Next piece after that, facing away from you. Just orient that each time you put a new piece up there. What that's going to do is orient the grain direction. This is going to minimize warping when you're constantly washing and drying this board every day. It's just a lot easier to do them pencil marks in the beginning and saves time during this step. Another thing I like to do is if there's any defects in the wood, whether it be a knot, whether it be a little check mark, I usually like to have all those defects on one side. So I'll just kind of play around with these pieces a little bit and decide on what I like, decide on what looks best while trying to put defects on one of the sides. Once I like it, I flip all the pieces back up on edge, put them together, and this is where you can check again that your pencil marks are every other one. So one's going to be a pencil mark, one's not going to be. And then I'll go through and glue all of them at once and then just put them together. Pretty simple at this point. Now, if your pieces of wood are all straight and true, you shouldn't really need any cauls at this point. You know, pieces of wood to hold it flat. I usually just make sure that the pieces are tight up against the clamp, or tight down on the clamp, I should say, at that metal part. And this will ensure a flat glue up. But by all means, if you got cauls, you can use them at this point. The next day, I will make my way back to the planer, and like I said, if you don't have a planer, you will make your way to either a heavy grit sandpaper or even a belt sander, depending on how uneven your glue up was. But this is where I'll get it down to final thickness. I'll basically just plane it until there's no more defects and everything is even on each side. And speaking of the new to me table saw, I actually just picked up a new to me Grizzly planer as well. It's another older one, just like the table saw, but it is 220 volt. It is 15 inches, so it gives me a couple extra inches than this DeWalt planer. And it's also a spiral head. Be on the lookout for that in the next video. Extremely excited for that. After we got it planed to final thickness, we go yet again back to the table saw, back to the crosscut sled, and I trim this to length. My length will be pretty much different every single cutting board I make. I just cut them down to length as to what looks best for the width, as well as cutting off any defects I don't like on the edges, or snipe from the planer. Usually the snipe's pretty minimal, so you can sand that out. But on these wild pieces that were glued up between 18 and 20 inches, I'll usually cut them down to 15 or 16 inches. At this point in the project, this is the point where you're going to want to do any of the routing you want to do. So maybe you want to put a juice groove in this for meats. Maybe you want to put a roundover on the edge. This is the time to do that stuff. In my case for these, I'm going to be using a cove bit and just putting in some handles on each end. Now what I'm doing here is I'm using my router table with a couple blocks on each end to do this. But doing it this way was kind of a pain and it left some terrible burn marks. I do fix this in the end and I make a jig for my little palm router that I'll show you. So it worked, but the burn marks needed to be taken care of, which I'll show you. And another thing I also do is just chamfer the corners with a 45-degree bit in my palm router. I run it along each side on every corner. This just breaks down that sharp corner, that sharp edge, evenly all around the board. How bad is that burn mark from the handle bothering you right now? Because it is bothering me pretty bad. Okay, next up, after all your routing is done, it is time for sanding. Lovely, lovely sanding. Now, how much time you spend at the sander is going to depend on if you have a planer. If you don't have a planer, like I said, you may need to start with a belt sander. What I do is I start with 80 grit, mark the whole board with a pencil, and sand until that pencil is gone. It's the oldest trick in the book, but I love using it. It helps me sand a lot evenly. Even. It helps me sand evenly. I also tried taking my detail sander and sanding away those router burn marks and was completely unsuccessful at it. After the entire board's completely sanded to 80 grit, I simply repeat that with 120 grit. And when I'm making a cutting board, this is as high as I'll go, is 120 grit. And I'll tell you why 120 grit is as high as I go once we start finishing these. But first, I gotta put my logo on them. To do this, I just use my little handheld laser engraver and put them on each side of the board in the right corner. I'm big on putting my logo on things like this. I don't know, I just think it gives it a little added dimension, a little added look, and looks more professional. Now we are finally ready to finish these boards. Now one final thing I will do is water pop the grain. Simply spray water on the entire board, let it air dry. To speed up the air drying process, I use just a little fan that you can see here on the back of my workbench. And I'll also mix in a little isopropyl alcohol with the water, kind of like a 50-50 mix of them. Alcohol evaporates quicker than water, so that'll just kind of speed up the drying process of the board. Then once dry, I'll simply sand again completely over it at 120 grit. So the same grit we did before it. It's just water popping it and giving it a final sanding. Alright, now we are ready to start applying finish. For these cutting boards, I am using 100% pure tung oil. Now, all the cutting boards I've built before this video, I have used 100% mineral oil. But by using mineral oil, when you're washing and drying the cutting board a lot, I have not been completely impressed with the results. So I started doing a little more research, and I read a lot of great things about pure tung oil. Now what I will do next time is probably thin this a little bit with a food safe solvent, like a citrus solvent. I didn't have any during this video, so I just used straight pure tung oil, and honestly, I love the way this finished it. Yes, the drying time was a little longer, but that's another thing that solvent will do, is speed up the drying process. Stupid fly. Get the fuck out of here. I just killed the fly. I don't know if you noticed that, but I'm doing my voiceover and you can see it in the window right there. I just backhanded it against the window, so sorry if you heard the fly. But you will no longer hear that fly. Okay, back to the voiceover. Alright, where was I? The tung oil. I really love the way this tung oil went on. Obviously, Locust didn't really have that grain pop too much. It's nothing like walnut, but it still looks pretty good. And as you see, during this first coat, I applied it with just a blue shop rag. I do not recommend that. I just did this because I was waiting on something to come from Amazon that I'll show you on the next coat. But the shop towels do work. There's just an alternative I like more than I'll show you in a minute. Alright, now you're probably wondering what's going on with these burnt handles. There is nothing more frustrating than burn marks in the router marks. So I kept going along on these boards, hoping they would miraculously disappear, and at this point, they didn't. I needed to come up with something. What I did was I took my palm router. What this was going to do was give me more control of the speed I was able to run the router bit along it. So I simply just made a jig that I clamped to the end of the board. I held up the board upright with one of my parallel clamps, and I crept up on the router marks that were already there. If I did this from the beginning, I would just do this in really shallow passes on full speed. And then once I got to a depth I like of the handles, which is where we're at now, to get rid of these burn marks, what I do is put the router on the lowest speed setting possible. And then I will take an extra light pass with the router and run the router through quickly. So a low speed on the router and quick on the board. And by doing that, as you can see, it completely gets rid of the burn marks. So that is much better. And keep in mind, I made 7 boards and I had to redo this on all 7. So this jig is much better than the router table, and I will use this from now on just with the palm router. You live and you learn, right? So now, seeing as that router mark exposed new wood again, what I did was take a Q-tip and basically water popped this part one more time. Just wetted it down, let it dry, and then resanded the raised grain lightly to smooth it out. And now what I'm going to do is put my second and final coat of tung oil on. And this is where I will hand sand at 220 in between grits just to smooth it out. And this is what I recommend using for the tung oil, not the blue shop towels. This is a Scotch-Brite pad. It's just a white abrasive pad, but it's not too abrasive. Actually, I don't know if it's Scotch-Brite. I'll link it on Amazon down below. But I use this to apply Rubio Monocoat or any hard wax oil like that as well. And this just gets rid of any dust nibs or anything else that's in there, and it'll smooth it out, but not ruin the grain of the wood. And another thing it does is the blue shop towels will tend to absorb the oil, which tung oil is no cheap date. So I want to keep as most on the board as I can. And these pads do not absorb too much oil. So this is how I like to apply it. And then anything that's sitting on there excess, I'll let it sit a couple minutes, and then I'll just wipe it off with a shop towel as much as I can, as clean as possible. Now, the difference from mineral oil is this tung oil is going to take quite a bit longer to dry. So I let these dry for a good 2 to 3 days. And I did have a fan on them just to kind of speed up that drying process. But I do think it left a lot more of a durable finish. So for this batch of boards I made, I did buy just really low profile rubber feet. I don't want to make these boards any more bulky really than they need to be. So these feet are actually less than a 1/4 inch thick. I'll link them on Amazon as well. And I tend to put rubber feet on my cutting boards. I like to use them like that. And then also, if there is any defects on one side of your board, this is why I put all the defects on one side. You're going to put your feet on that side where the defects are. So for instance, this cherry board I made here had a bunch of knots that would have just made this board unusable if it was double-sided. But seeing as how I was using these feet, I simply screwed them on that side, and I filled those knots with epoxy just to make it look better. But you don't want to cut on epoxy. It's not food safe. You want what you're cutting on to be completely wood. So by putting those feet on this board, that's going to ensure that whoever's using the board is going to be cutting on top, and it's going to be completely wood. But I did fill them with epoxy because during washing and stuff, you don't want water to get in and sit in those knots. So that is why I tend to put feet on, and I tend to put really low profile feet on, not big bulky ones. So as a woodworker, I've never done a video on a cutting board, and cutting boards are usually one of the first things woodworkers like to make. It's just something everyone uses, and I like using a natural product like wood over plastic all day, any day. So I needed to make one for myself, so I decided to batch out a bunch of them and make a video. I will have these boards available on my website, which if you're watching this, you probably don't care because you're going to make your own. So, if you're making your own, hopefully this video helped you, gave you some inspiration, and kind of walked you through some steps on how to build them. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye, guys.